Picture this scene. You are standing in a laboratory that looks like it belongs in the 31st century. The man working there is arguably the smartest human being to ever live. On his workbench sits a prototype no bigger than a shoebox, a fusion reactor capable of providing free, clean energy to the entire continent, effectively ending climate change and resource wars overnight. You watch him tinker with it, expecting him to call a press conference or release the patent to the world. But then an alarm blares. A guy in a rhino costume is knocking over a bank truck downtown. Immediately, the genius's demeanor shifts. He doesn't pack up the device to solve the global energy crisis. Instead, he mounts this miracle of infinite power onto a car, or perhaps a suit of armor, and rushes out the door to punch a common criminal in the face. It is a baffling allocation of resources. You have a being with the power of a god and the intellect of a supercomputer, yet he spends his Tuesday nights acting like a glorified riot policeman. He could turn the Sahara into a garden, or cure every known disease before lunch, but he chooses to maintain the status quo, fighting symptoms rather than curing the world. Why does the existence of Superman not result in a superworld? Why do these heroes, who can defy the laws of physics, seem utterly incapable of changing the evening news?
That image you just laid out, that baffling allocation of resources, that's really the heart of what we're getting into today.
It's the central paradox, isn't it?
It is. And our mission in this deep dive is to really analyze that failure of imagination you see in these stories, where you have this incredible, almost limitless power, but it's only ever used for these, routine surface level fights.
And we want to explore how that constraint in fiction, it kind of mirrors a very real frustration we see in the world today.
Exactly. It's this deep frustration you feel when you look at our own elite institutions.
I think we all know that feeling.
Yeah.
You look at a government, a huge corporation, some foundation with billions of dollars, and you see they have the tech, they have the money, they have the means to tackle huge systemic problems.
But they just don't. There's this profound lack of political will to actually do it. It's a feeling people describe as a kind of noble betrayal.
A noble betrayal, I like that. It's the sense that rational people feel when they see common sense and meritocracy just undermined.
Right. Why are we still having the same conversation about climate change when the industrial power to fix it is right there? It's the same pattern. In fiction, it's Iron Man punching the vulture instead of, creating a global food system.
And in reality, it's just this baffling institutional inertia, always treating the symptoms, never the disease itself.
And the status quo is preserved. So today, we're diving into why the superhero genre is, almost fundamentally built to do just that, to preserve the status quo.
Okay, so we're looking at the story mechanics, the philosophy, the whole structure. This goes way beyond just finding plot holes. Let's get into it.
So a good place to start is with the basic function of the superhero. Thinkers like the anthropologist David Graeber have pointed out that they are, at their core, reactionary figures.
Reactionary in what sense?
In the sense that they don't have their own projects, they have no proactive plan for the world, their entire role is just to react to whatever the villain is doing.
So they're defined by what they stop, not by what they build.
Precisely. The villain sets the world on fire, the hero puts the fire out, and everything has to be reset.
Return to factory settings, ready for the next issue, the next movie. The world has to be put back to zero.
And that function is so important because it locks the hero into being a conservative figure. I don't mean politically conservative necessarily, but a conserver of the existing order.
They're defending the world as it is against any kind of disruptive power.
Yeah.
Which is always framed as just, crime.
Right. And if they actually addressed the root causes, the things that create crime or poverty in the first place, well, the story would stop being episodic. The whole model would fall apart.
And this need for a story that always resets itself, that goes back way further than comic books, right? This is kind of in the DNA of all Western storytelling.
Absolutely. You can trace it all the way back to the ancient Greeks. We have to bring in the work of the theater director, Augusto Boal here.
Okay.
He did this incredible analysis of the hidden political function inside Western drama, and he traces it straight back to Aristotle's Poetics.
So for Aristotle, art wasn't just about telling a good story.
Not at all. For him, tragedy wasn't just imitation mimesis. It had a job to do. It was a corrective measure.
Corrective, as in guiding people towards some kind of ideal state.
Exactly. And for Aristotle, the ideal state was achieved through politics, the art of running the state as it currently existed. And we have to remember, His society had slavery. It had rigid hierarchies.
And he saw that system as being fundamentally just.
He did. So for him, political virtue meant knowing your place in that system and, sticking to it.
Which means the word catharsis meant something very different to him than it does to us. We think of it as like a good cry at a movie, an emotional release.
Right, but the original concept was much more, coercive. It was a political tool.
A tool for what?
For purging the audience of any emotions that might disrupt that social order, things like righteous indignation or, revolutionary urges. It was designed to pacify the audience, to calm them down politically.
Wow. So the very foundation of Western drama, the tradition that informs basically all our movies, is designed to be conservative. To, as Bowles says, intimidate the spectator and get rid of illegal tendencies.
It's a huge claim, but the logic is there, and you see it play out perfectly today. When a superhero saves the day and restores the world, they are performing that exact conservative catharsis.
The crisis is over, the audience feels that emotional release, and any desire for real, radical change gets channeled away.
And the message, even if it's subconscious, is that the system works. Because the alternative, the villain's crazy plan, was so much worse.
But this is where it gets complicated, because the powers these heroes have, they feel like they should be for radical change. A hero who can move planets is stuck cleaning up bank robberies. Which brings us to this idea of a modularity dilemma.
Yes, the modularity dilemma. It's this tension between how real-world problems work and how simple stories need to work.
Okay, so what's a modular system?
Think of Lego bricks or a big collaborative research project online. These are systems that are flexible, adaptable, made of many interconnected parts. They're about process, not a single finished product.
And real-world problems, climate change, poverty, inequality, they're all modular like that.
Yeah.
They're messy, interconnected, and they require long-term collaborative work.
Exactly. But superpowers, in a story, they offer these very clean, short-term, fixed solutions. A hero could snap his fingers and get rid of all the plastic in the ocean.
That's a finished product. It solves the symptom.
But it doesn't touch the actual cause, the supply chains, the consumer habits, the lack of regulation that created the problem in the first place. You can't tell a compelling story about a hero spending 10 years lobbying governments.
No, because the story needs that clean ending. The villain is punched, the world is saved, the credits roll. It creates this illusion of wholeness.
An illusion that completely hides the messy, fragmented reality of how you actually make progress. A traditional story needs to show a single, clear path from problem to solution.
But if you tried to show the real complexity of solving something like poverty, with all the political trade-offs and failures and dead ends,
the whole heroic narrative would just fall apart. The authority of the single hero's victory would dissolve. So the genre is basically structured to avoid that complexity.
Which means the villain has to be a person. An individual problem that can be punched or put in jail.
Right, because if the villain was the entire global economic system, what do? The hero would either have to destroy the world to fix it, or they'd just fail. And neither of those options sells tickets for a sequel.
So it's all about containment. The story has to contain the problem so it can be solved episodically. And that's how the status quo is always preserved.
So now that we've looked at the structure, the container, we need to look at what's inside it, the ideology itself. How are these movies pushing very specific political ideas?
And I think the best place to start for that is Captain America. Civil War. I mean, it's one of the most overtly political superhero films ever made.
It is. And it was marketed as this big, ambiguous question, freedom versus safety. But if you look at the mechanics of the story, it's gently nudging you to pick a side.
And it does that through Tony Stark.
Yes. Tony is set up as the classic tragic hero. And in a tragedy, the hero's downfall has to come from their hamartia, their fatal flaw.
So what's Tony's fatal flaw in Civil War?
It's his impulsiveness. His choices aren't based on some deep political principle. They're based on emotion, specifically on guilt.
Right. He agrees to the Sokovia Accords, the government oversight, right after he gets confronted by that grieving mother. It's a gut reaction.
It's pure guilt. And his final act in the movie, attacking Bucky and Cap, is driven by raw vengeance, not any sense of justice. He is ruled by his emotions.
And the film makes it very clear that his suffering, the breakup of the Avengers, is a direct result of that flaw.
So the catharsis we feel from watching his downfall isn't just about Tony. It pushes the audience to condemn the idea he represents.
The idea of institutional control, of giving up individual freedom for a feeling of safety. The story is structured to make you feel that Captain America, the superior individual, was right to reject that control.
You see this same pattern over and over again when heroes fight what are basically dark mirror versions of themselves.
Like Killmonger in Black Panther, or Karli Morgenthau, the Flag Smasher, and Falcon and the Winter Soldier.
These villains are really useful ideological tools because they often start from a place that's actually, kind of valid.
They have a legitimate critique of the system. Killmonger is talking about global oppression. Karli Morgenthau wants a world without borders because she saw a better way was possible during the blip.
But the narrative has to make their methods monstrous. They have to go too far. The catharsis we feel when they're defeated is a release of that desire for radical change. We get to condemn the method, not the original critique.
It's like a safety valve. The story lets you feel the anger about the injustice, but then channels it into rejecting the radical solution.
First, a fear-based catharsis that reassures you that law and order is better than chaos. But then there's a second step.
The moment of pity.
Yeah.
Right before they die, they show their human side.
Exactly. And that pity-based catharsis allows the hero, T'Challa, or Sam Wilson, to then adopt a tiny diluted piece of the villain's original idea.
So T'Challa doesn't arm the oppressed around the world. He opens an outreach center in Oakland. Sam Wilson doesn't tear down borders. He gives a nice speech to a bunch of politicians.
It's peaceful incrementalism, and that is the ultimate ideological function. It always pushes the audience back towards the safe, moderate, center-left. The huge systemic problems the villains brought up, they're still there.
So the narrative structure coerces us away from any kind of radical change and steers us back to the familiar center. And this all hinges on the idea of the hero as this exceptional individual.
And to really understand where that idea comes from, you have to go back even further, back to the Italian Renaissance.
Okay, that's a leap. What's the connection?
It's about the rise of the bourgeoisie, the new capitalist class. They were replacing the old feudal aristocracy who justified their power through, divine right and bloodlines.
The new merchant class didn't have that. They needed a new justification for their power and their wealth.
And they found it in an idea that Niccolò Machiavelli called virtù.
Which we usually translate as virtue, but it doesn't just mean being a good person.
Not at all. Machiavellian virtù is about individual willpower. It's the ability to get things done, the cunning, the drive, the sheer effectiveness that lets someone impose their will on the world. It was the perfect value system for this new class.
And it created this foundational modern myth that successful, powerful people are in charge, not because of luck or privilege, but because they are just innately better. They have more virtue.
And the superhero is the ultimate embodiment of that ideal. The powers are just the tool. The real source of their heroism is their pre-existing personal quality.
Right. Iron Man 3 is all about how Tony Stark is a hero because of his mind, not the suit. Captain America was chosen for the serum because of his idealism and moral courage.
Even Thor, who is a literal god, has to learn that his power comes from within himself. The story constantly reinforces this idea of innate superiority.
They're modern-day Napoleons, great individuals who bend the world to their will.
And that narrative justifies why they get to operate outside the normal rules. It's the same bourgeois myth. Their exceptionalism is proof that they deserve to be exceptional.
So when Civil War argues that this small group of superpeople should be above international law, the story is tapping into this very old, very powerful idea about individual greatness to get the audience on board.
It's a two-pronged attack. The conservative catharsis contains radical ideas, and the myth of individual exceptionalism justifies the hero's right to rule.
Okay, so if the hero operates outside the law because of their superior virtue, that puts them in a very tricky political position. It challenges the whole idea of the modern state.
It does. And this gets us into a fundamental paradox of law itself, something called constituent power.
Let's bring in David Graeber's work here again. He talks about how law ultimately has to come from something illegal.
Right. Revolution, the very foundation of the modern state, which claims to have a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence, is built on acts of treason.
The American founders, the French revolutionaries, they were all criminals under the laws of their time.
Exactly. And this creates a problem that liberal political theory can't really solve. What's the difference between the people creating a new government and just a rampaging mob? The line is completely blurry.
And the superhero and the supervillain both exist in that same blurry, extra-legal space.
Graeber calls it an inherently fascist space, where individuals claim the right to use violence outside the state's control. Gangsters, revolutionaries, superheroes, they're all there. The great criminal, like Kingpin or the Joker, creates their own set of rules, their own alternative system.
But the hero is different. The hero has to defend the system.
Yes, they are almost parasitical off the villains, because without the villain's disruptive plot, the hero has no purpose. They're forced to defend a legal and political system that they know is broken.
But they have to defend it, because the only alternative the story ever gives you is the villain's authoritarian New World Order.
Right, so the hero doesn't want to change the world, they just want to return it to its familiar, flawed state. In doing so, they validate the existing power structures.
So even though they operate outside the law, they end up reinforcing the state's monopoly on violence. But at the same time, the law itself is shown to be pretty weak.
Or easily manipulated. This brings up the idea of security theater.
Which is the idea from security expert Bruce Schneier, right? Measures that make us feel safe but don't actually do much.
Exactly. And in Civil War, Tony Stark treats the Sokovia Accords just like that. It's not about real oversight for him. It's a PR fire he needs to put out. He figures they can just change the documents later in secret.
So the law is just a tool for the powerful, whether that's a superhero or a villain.
And you see this even more clearly with the street-level heroes like Daredevil or Batman. Take Wilson Fisk, the Kingpin. He doesn't just break the law, he uses it. He sees it as a moral gloss, a smokescreen to hide behind.
He builds his criminal empire inside the legal system. He wraps himself in legitimacy.
And that's why it's so powerful when Matt Murdock, the lawyer, threatens him not with his fists, but with the law itself. He says, I can break you without breaking a single law. He recognizes the system itself can be a devastating weapon.
Meanwhile, a hero like Batman, who is totally outside the system, is always at risk of becoming irrelevant. He just has to accept his status.
Right. He tells Alfred, we're criminals. We have always been criminals. His entire identity is based on disrupting the state's monopoly on violence, but in the end, he's just doing the state's dirty work for it. He's their deniable, violent agent.
So the law is struggling to contain these exceptional individuals. But what happens when the power level is just off the charts? When you have a literal god like Superman or the Hulk?
That's what's known as an out-of-context problem.
A threat that is so big, so new, that it just breaks all the existing rules.
Yes. And the classic example is Superman's big battle in Metropolis. The way it was filmed was meant to look like 9/11, like this massive act of terrorism that changes everything. It forces the world to think about security on a planetary scale.
And the military is shown to be completely useless against him. Their best weapons are like toys.
This kind of godlike power is what's called a castrating threat to the legal system. It just makes it obsolete. And it's not just fiction. People worry that our own interconnected technology, the Internet of Things, could create a similar kind of world-sized robot threat that our current laws can't handle.
And this threat is what pushes characters like Batman to adopt the 1% doctrine.
Right. The idea that if there's even a 1% chance that Superman could become our enemy, we have to treat it as a certainty and be ready to destroy him.
So that level of power forces a preemptive, almost tyrannical response just to feel safe.
And the story always has to find a way to contain that, to bring the out-of-context problem back into context. Because the world as we know it can't survive with a god just walking around. The status quo has to be restored.
It's just amazing how all these threads lead back to the same conclusion. And you see these contradictions inside the narratives themselves. They critique power, they critique capitalism, but they always end up defending it.
And to really understand that, we need one more concept, the ideologium.
Yeah, okay, that sounds technical. Break it down for us.
It's basically the smallest possible unit of an ideology. Think of it like an atom. And it has two parts, a conceptual idea and a story that expresses that idea.
So these films have a crisis because they're built on a tension between two things, the metaphor and the meconomy.
Exactly. The metaphor is the big abstract ideal, freedom, peace, justice.
And the metonymy is the messy material reality, the actual inequality, the actual wars.
Right. So in Iron Man, the metaphor is peace. But the metonymy is that Tony Stark can only achieve it by building a terrifying weapon and acting as a global policeman. The ideal and the reality are in conflict.
And the story has to resolve that tension. But instead of changing the system, it just tries to clean up the ideal. It addresses the abuses, but never the structure itself.
All in service of preserving American hegemonic ideals, Captain America's fight for freedom becomes a stand-in for saving the entire world. And in doing so, it validates the American way as the global default.
Okay, so let's connect all of this now to the real-world debates about power and social change that are happening right now. The villains in these stories often represent a kind of radical social theory.
They do, and that framework has become really influential in modern movements that fall under the umbrella of critical theory.
Which is an intellectual tradition that really starts with Karl Marx.
Yes, with Marx's antagonistic social theory. The idea that society is fundamentally a war between two groups, the oppressors and the oppressed.
For Marx, that was purely economic. The bourgeoisie who own everything, and the proletariat who are exploited.
But later thinkers expanded that idea way beyond just economics. Now it includes analysis of racial, colonial, gender, and other forms of oppression. And the framework still encourages conflict as the way to achieve a radical social revolution.
So in this view, the problem isn't just a few bad guys, which is what the superhero story tells you. The problem is the entire system is built on oppression.
And that brings us back to that classic Marxist idea of substructure and superstructure. The substructure is the core economic or racial system of power.
And the superstructure is everything else. Politics, law, the media, the arts, religion.
And according to this theory, the superstructure isn't neutral. It exists purely to protect and defend the oppressive substructure.
So if you believe that, then you don't see the police or the courts as flawed institutions that need reform. You see them as tools of the oppressor class, period.
And some critics of this viewpoint argue that this leads to these attempts to just tear down institutions completely. The call to defund the police, for example, comes from this logic. If the institution's only purpose is oppression, you can't reform it, you have to abolish it.
Which is a complete departure from a more traditional view of society as this complex web of different groups and institutions working together.
And alongside this structural critique, there's also a very intense focus on the individual will, something you could call the voluntaristic will to power.
This sounds like Nietzsche.
It's heavily influenced by Nietzsche and Foucault, yeah. The idea is that if there is no objective truth, if God is dead, then absolute power shifts from God to the individual. The individual's will to power, or as an existentialist like Sartre would say, their absolute freedom, becomes the only thing that creates reality and value.
So my identity isn't determined by anything external like my body or where I was born. It's determined purely by my own sovereign choice. My internal feeling is what's real.
Exactly. The interior true me has total sovereignty over the exterior material world. This is the root of a lot of contemporary rhetoric around identity. External facts, whether biological or moral, are seen as oppressive constraints.
And what happens when you apply that radical individualism to an entire society? What do critics of this ideology say is the result?
They argue it leads to a kind of chaos, because it takes what are called secondary values, things like diversity or equity, which are valuable in a certain context, and it makes them absolute values, valuable in and of themselves. And when you do that, you lose the context, and they become these arbitrary rules that can destabilize society.
So you have these two competing ideas of the individual. In the superhero story, the exceptional individual with their virtues upholds the system.
And in the radical critique, the individual's absolute will to power demands the total destruction of that same system.
Which brings us to the final piece of the puzzle. The philosophical dead end that really traps both the superhero world and our own, the unresolved theodicy.
Theodicy, the oldest question. If God is good and all-powerful, why is there evil and suffering in the world?
And in our context, the question is, if Superman is good and all-powerful, why is there still poverty and war and crime? Why doesn't he just fix everything?
It's the central contradiction that the genre can never, ever solve. It just has to keep deferring the question.
The Bible does the same thing, right? It gives a bunch of different, sometimes conflicting answers for why people suffer.
It does. Sometimes it's punishment, sometimes it's a test. But then you get to the book of Job, which just blows up the whole idea that suffering is deserved. Job suffers for no reason, and God never gives him a straight answer why. The problem is contained, not solved.
And this need to just defer the big questions leads us to the final critique.
Yeah.
What's called capitalist realism.
Which is just the widespread, almost unconscious acceptance that our current socioeconomic system, capitalism, is the only viable option. It's the end of history.
So it's not just that the superheroes choose to protect the system. It's that we, the writers, the audience, maybe our own leaders, can't even imagine a coherent alternative.
It has literally become easier to imagine a single person with the power of a god stopping an asteroid than it is to imagine real, complex, collective political action solving climate change. We'd rather see the genius put the fusion reactor in his car to punch a robber, treat the symptom, than use it to cure the disease.
Because our own political imagination is paralyzed.
And that really is the core finding here. Superheroes don't change the world because the stories are built from the ground up to contain that kind of radical power. They translate massive systemic political problems into small, individual conflicts that can be solved without ever threatening the status quo. The very constraint that feels so baffling to us is a perfect mirror of the inertia we see in our own world.
And yet we still need these stories. They are essential, not because they give us any answers, they clearly don't, but because they give us a language. There are modern myths. They give us a way to talk about and to question overwhelming power, whether that power is in a superhero costume or whether it's hidden away inside a boardroom or a government bureaucracy. And maybe the real power of these stories is the question they leave us with. What if our own elites aren't trapped by the system? What if they're just making a choice?